Thanks for joining. Welcome to Product Connections. My name is Christine Perfetti, and I'm the host for today. For those of you who I haven't met before, I wanted to give a little insight in terms of what the purpose is of these sessions. One of the real goals from these sessions is to keep the conversations small but interactive. So the goal for these sessions is to have about 5, 10, 15 attendees having an opportunity to talk with our speakers. So the way the format works for the day, I have some questions that I'd love to ask Holly. And Holly, thank you for joining. I'm excited to introduce you in a
Mm.
second, but we're thrilled to have you here. We only met late last year, and what I thought about was I should have known you for much, much longer.
Yeah.
And the reason is when I think about the conversations we've had in the last year and also just seeing your impressive background, you're a pioneer and thought leader in both the agile space and the product management space. So the fact that I hadn't asked to talk to you sooner was a mistake on my part. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to meet, Holly's the founding partner of Digital Product Partners. In addition to that, she's also the head of product coaching and consulting for Jeff Patton and Associates. Holly is a go-to when I'm asking questions in terms of agile best practices, product thinking. Holly is the go-to, I'll go to for answers. So I'm really excited you're here today, Holly. Thank you. Hi, how are
What
you?
good. What a sweet introduction, Christine. I really appreciate that.
I'm
Uh,
very happy to have you here.
yeah, I can certainly say that I've been doing this a long time. My degree all those years ago was actually in chemistry, and it was interesting to get involved in startups in the late 90s. But while I was thinking about introducing myself, I did remember that I had a Commodore 64 in 1981 because my father was a beta tester of the Commodore 64 before it came out. And so I've been in the technology space for quite some time, but it's been interesting to go from startups and then doing heavy research and then working with organizations inside trying to transform into more of a product oriented point of view or organization, even in companies, to then trying to help companies both scale up in product thinking but also introduce things like OKRs and organizational change management and things like that to even manufacturing companies. I mean, I worked with Ford in 2013. So over 10 years ago, I was the first coach trying to do this at Ford Motor Company. So it's been an interesting time, and I certainly have learned a lot. I appreciate you calling me a thought leader. I would say I've been doing this a long time and have learned quite a bit.
I like to
So
think of us as seasoned, right?
yes, very
um,
seasoned and scars to prove it. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's
Hmm.
why I mentioned I have a lot of questions for you. And if attendees have questions as well, I'd love for them to have a chance to ask them. To start, in terms of the work you've been doing with product teams, I've been thinking a lot about, I hear product leaders using different terms and different ways to describe their processes. And I do know some of your superpowers. And in terms of superpowers, I know you're helping organizations transform to what you refer to as the product mindset and product thinking approach.
Hmm.
Before I jump into how you do that, can you describe to me what product thinking is in your own words?
Oh, sure. So I think product thinking has been around a while, and the most attributed person for this product thinking is Marty Kagan, probably, which is originally his book Inspired came out, and that sort of laid out what good product management looks like and thinking about products, which really is thinking about outcomes and impacts.
Yeah.
So I always talk about it. And by the way, like I'm not the only one because the truth is the truth, right? So we're always thinking about what are outcomes that we're looking for, and that's defined by changes in behavior by customers and
Mhm.
users, which makes it difficult because companies don't have control over that,
Yep.
but they need things from their customers and users like sales and changes in behavior. And then what are the impacts we're looking for as a business? And who's going to give us the outcomes that we need to to be sustainable as a business.
Mhm.
So when
Mhm.
I'm thinking about product thinking, I'm always thinking about what's valuable, what's feasible, what's viable and what's going to be usable and desirable,
Yep.
which are these four circles that Marty. But time and time again, I told you I have a degree in chemistry, so I take a scientific view. And I think one of the reasons you and I get along so is that I have a research background and hypotheses are always a thing in science. And so I always look at these, whatever framework, whatever mindset, and I think, how does this break? Where does
Hmm.
this break? Where can I break it? Where does it not make sense?
Okay. Yep.
And that valuable, viable, feasible, usable, those four circles, it's very difficult to break them, and I haven't done it yet. So I'll just be having a conversation and it'll come back to one of those four or overcorrecting to one of those four.
Yep.
So
Yep.
that's really how I think about it, how I define
Thanks, Holly. You may have seen me laughing. I think there's many reasons we get along well.
it. Yes, it's true. It's what?
Well, and I know you're a pro going into organizations who initially the product leaders or engineering leaders, whoever the leaders are coming in-house,
Mhm.
will have you assess the landscape of an organization. So this whole notion of product thinking and having a product mindset across the organization, when you're brought in by leaders to assess the landscape and maturity of an organization, basically assessing to the degree the organization is already well equipped with a product thinking approach. How do you do that? How do you assess the maturity of an organization?
So I've used a few methods over time, and so I would say I'm always doing it.
Yeah.
So I'm constantly doing it depending on who I'm talking to. So in the run up to this conversation, I was thinking a lot about this because clients, as a consultant, clients will ask you for certain things and they will be sure. For example, in my world, I get asked to come in and coach product managers to use story mapping
Mm-hmm.
and be able to break the story map down into user stories. When I start talking to the product managers, what I find out is they have no collaboration with any of their stakeholders. They're set up in a services model. They're treated like project managers, and they don't have they have very few actual developers that they're working with. I'm not kidding you. I just talked to a client yesterday. They had what they told me was, I'm quoting, 75% of a development resource. So
Wow.
I'm coming in to talk to them about how to upskill their abilities. And they're suffering because their stakeholders say, we have product managers, but they haven't helped us deliver anything. And organizationally, they're not set up correctly for success or to measure outcomes or to do discovery or any of the things we know you really need to do. I've been brought in by leadership with
Mm-hmm.
a specific ask, but then and so my job there is to help leadership understand they actually have. We can talk about user story mapping and breaking down the stories, but there are fundamental problems that need to be solved organizationally
Yep.
also.
Yep.
And I
Yep.
think that's a much more difficult. Everybody just wants to say, let's skill our people up and go.
Yep. Yep.
But it's very rarely the case that's successful in the
Mm-hmm.
long term. It can
Yep.
actually make people leave the company too when they realize I should be doing this
Mm-hmm.
and they can't do it. They want to go somewhere else where they can. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. I promised this was a session about OKRs. So I promise I'm moving over to
Okay,
talk
yeah.
to you about OKRs in a minute.
Okay. All right.
Before I do that, I'm promising, but I have one more question. So it comes up a lot. So another purpose of these sessions is to bring together product managers, UX professionals, and engineers to talk about
Hmm.
discussions. It's really enlightening to hear you talk about when you're going into an organization and the product managers and the product owners or the product coaches are feeling like they don't have the degree of influence and traction they'd like to have in the organization.
Hmm.
And the reason I mention this as an enlightening is we've had a few conversations with UX leaders coming in where it's the same old story, but their perception and mindset is that the product managers are running the show and they don't have the influence. So I'm curious, it's really funny seeing the different perspectives of competencies and team members, but I'm going to ask you about a product manager, the same question I've asked UX leaders. So when you come in and the product managers are saying they're struggling to gain influence and traction, what types of tips and recommendations are you giving them to move forward in the right direction? I know there's no magic approach, but what do
Mm.
you tell them?
Yeah, I've been asked this a lot, and by UX professionals also. Or
I'm sure.
I was asked to come in and be a guest lecturer at U of M for a UX
Mhm.
class, and that was one of the questions they asked me, is because they're starting their careers wanting to be
Mhm.
influential in organizations. And I have these conversations all the time with product managers as well. So, from my experience, be helpful and then cause trouble. So it's really
Yep,
right.
I
Be
like
be
that.
helpful and earn the right to cause trouble. Influence is how you make people feel, and it's also how they can gauge your results. So you want to be helpful and bring data and then cause trouble. And that's really the advice that I'm giving leaders as well, who are maybe they're leaders, but they're not the CEO or the CIO. It's really collaboration that you want. So it's great to be influential, and being influential will get you promoted. But being highly collaborative and sharing information is extremely important. So I work with product managers who they'll do a great story map, or they'll have laid out the entire process of something. I'll say, what does engineering think about this? They haven't shown it to engineering. Why have you not shown it to anybody in engineering? They're organizational, so they're working in organizational silos, and there aren't real product teams set up.
Mhm.
Right. So
Mhm.
there isn't a discovery team that includes somebody from technology, somebody from UX, and somebody from who's got the product chops, right?
Mhm. Mhm. Yep.
So
Yep.
so companies that are struggling because they don't feel like they're delivering the right thing, or they want more product thinking, the collaboration is really the thing that you need. And a lot of product managers have not been rewarded for being collaborative. They've been rewarded for owning it. So product managers do, because there is no now as opposed to UX and engineering, product management does not just now nascent that you have a career path with education behind it in product management.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
And that's another reason that this is a struggle,
You
because you have a whole bunch of different types of people in product management.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
speaking to something too in terms of in what ways are product managers and product leaders rewarded? And it hasn't always been about being a team-based collaborative approach to product development and management. I'm curious your take. We have a shared philosophy on this, but when I've been talking to product leaders, it's a big burden. If you're trying to make all the decisions in your little silo. And the way I've been describing it is you shouldn't be going it alone. None of us should have to go it alone. And I'm curious when you're talking with any of these product leaders, when you're telling them or product managers the team-based collaborative approach is the way to go, are they buying in or are they still feeling really bought into what they're hearing from the organization in terms of what's success? What are you hearing from them?
I'll hear things like need to work with a culture,
Mhm.
or I don't have time because
Mhm.
I need to submit project status reports. In a lot of cases, in many cases, product managers aren't getting treated like product managers. They're getting treated like project managers. And these silos are forming in organizations, and working with another client where the product managers will say, no one knows why we exist. No one knows what our value is. And then to show their value, they need to get in front of users and do discovery and know better about the user, know better about
Yeah.
the impact and all of that than anyone else. But they don't have the time because they're expected, they have their feet in this sort of more waterfally, you might call it, or hierarchical way of talking and reporting with PowerPoints, status reports. And after they're done with all of that, they don't have a lot of time. It gets back to really does get back to enabling by leadership and insisting. And this is companies large and small also
Mm-hmm. Yep,
have
yep,
this.
yep. Okay, it took me 20 minutes, Holly, but I'd love to talk about OKRs.
Oh
And
yeah.
the way I'd love to approach this is starting a little bit with the basics, and then I have some questions for you. I've seen different organizations try to implement OKRs. Some have been very effective, some not so much. So I'd love to dig in there as well. But to start, this audience has heard of OKRs, but at a high level, how do you describe what are they and what is the main value and benefit of implementing them within an organization?
that OKRs have been around a very long time. And they are originally meant to, at Intel, Andrew Groves is the one who introduced those OKRs at Intel, and he was the CEO. So right there, when you talk about objectives and key results, there was a time when OKRs got famous from Google, then they've been brought back, then they had a lull where people weren't really thinking about them, and then they came back. But the concept, like I was saying with these four circles, what's true is true, but having objectives that are inspirational and that really have a goal that's time boxed, that make it so that people understand what we're about and what we're trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that is well communicated and specific. So they're geared for teams. They're geared for teams. Now, key results, which are sometimes really confused with KPIs.
Yeah. Yeah.
I see organizations make this mistake all the time. So, but key results are really, what does success look like? What does success look for in a very quantitative way? We are trying to, so you mentioned before, Jeff, no, he has a sort of explainer about OKRs,
Mm-hmm.
and he's talking about by the end of Q2, we want to be, our authentication needs to be the easiest authentication for credit cards.
Mm-hmm.
Now, great, okay, that's time boxed, that has customer value to it. And it's talking about, it's an inspirational, like the easiest thing, the easiest way to authenticate. We know this is a problem. And then how are you going to measure that? And gee, I'm forgetting I love this subject, but one of the problems I see, so there are a couple of problems with implementing OKRs that I'm seeing a lot. One is just the communication and the communication of OKRs and the crafting of what is a good objective
Yeah.
for any given team, for the organization, for any given team. They'll tend to be blanket OKR statements that are general,
Mm.
best in the market or something. It means nothing
Yeah.
and it doesn't have any customer value. So those general OKRs don't work. Also, when they're not geared towards a team, they don't work. And then the key results don't work if you don't know. So, for example, a good key result would be to increase, we could say, we're going to increase usage by 50%.
Yep. Yep.
What's our current usage?
Yep.
You have to know what your current state is.
Absolutely. And have that benchmark data before you actually put
Right. You
together
have
key
to have,
results.
exactly. So is also discovery and research that needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
So a key problem that I've seen, and it didn't used to be as big a problem, and now it is that ability and empowerment of people to do research and to be well backed by data and for their key results.
Mm-hmm.
Because the key results end up being we shipped this, we did this, like a to-do list checklist,
Yeah.
instead of really being set up to say, oh, we met our objective and these are the results. And the last one I think there are two others. One is leading and lagging indicators. So everybody wants to call out, how do you know you're headed that way? And how do you know enough about your current state to know what the leading indicators are? Because it could take you a while to get to the lagging indicator, but if you can show progress, then that's success. And that's a big thing for product managers because sometimes they're working on larger things, but you can show iterative incremental results and say we're hitting our leading indicators to get there,
Yep. Yep.
which plays very well to leadership also. And then the last one I would say is there's a flavor of the day sort of thing going on with OKRs where Silicon Valley Partners was out doing a lot of training about OKRs with leadership and
Mm-hmm.
middle managers, and I've come across many of them actually, because Jeff and I will come in afterwards a bit, and they will go straight from the training to putting OKRs in people's individual evals, and they don't realize this is team play, and that they're not even. You can just look on Wikipedia, and it says that is a do not do with OKRs, right? You don't
Well,
put
I'm
them.
curious your take, Holly. I was going to ask you about this, where when OKRs are put into an individual's goal setting or performance management, I've actually seen teams rig the system. And what I mean by that is if you put a key result into place, what the team would start doing with their individual OKRs is be very conservative in terms of how they would try to move the needle and what their key result would be, because they knew if they could hit that key result, they would be rewarded. So they were gaming the system, and it was a horrible, the employees would laugh about it. It was just a horrible approach to try to achieve product success. Have you seen that at all?
Yeah, and that, and I talk about that too, because it is a lot of companies that we're working with, and a lot of companies I've seen in general, they're not set up in teams the way we would define it. So if you say it's a product team, it's a team that can deliver an outcome that creates an impact. End to end can create an outcome that creates an impact for the company, right?
Mhm.
That's the whole product team. So most companies are not set up that way. And so you end up with pieces and parts spread across, and you lose the narrative because there isn't good communication anyway, but it gets to be chaotic. So people end up, they're worried. If I just had this happen, I just had this conversation again. It's so funny, so timely, with people breaking down things into their functional silo to prove that they did work, to prove that they got stuff done. So their goal is to really say, I've been really busy. I did this and
Mhm.
this and this and this and this. So as soon as you have, and also when you're talking about the technology space, which is the space that I'm in product, there's are sensitive people. You can even say something bad to somebody in a meeting and they'll never talk again.
Yeah.
Everyone's very sensitive, and it's not about money. A lot of times it's about an atta girl or an atta boy, either withholding it or making somebody feel dumb in a meeting. And then, so that gaming is also generally a result of bad experiences people have had, where if they don't game it, they get in trouble,
Yep. Yep.
or they're asked the wrong question by their management, and the
Mhm.
incentives are not aligned to true product development. It's unfortunate, but it happens in a bunch of different types of ways. OKRs
Absolutely.
and KPIs and are one of them.
Absolutely. I hadn't given you a heads up about this, but I'm hoping you'll be a little game, Holly. I wanted to give you a scenario and ask how you'd handle this, because many of my clients are getting stuck in that they do know how to craft a good objective. They do know how to frame the key results, but they're struggling with the organizational transformation and change involved in terms of how to implement OKRs. And what I mean by that, a scenario I'm seeing for clients is that they've done the discovery work. They've talked with their customers. They've identified the problem space. They also have effectively established a product vision where they want to get with their product from a user experience standpoint. They already have their roadmap in place that's aligned with the vision. And now they're stuck. They're bought into the idea of OKRs. They haven't implemented them before, and they have their vision. They've done the discovery. They already have roadmaps. They're trying to decide, do we need to revisit that? How do they, in that circumstance where they've done a lot of the upfront groundwork, but they're not sure then how to integrate OKRs into that? Like, how do you guide teams through that process? And I know it's just one scenario, but that's a common one I'm hearing from teams.
That's a really good one. So I was talking to a product manager last week who, you know, it, I hate to, I'm giving you the consulting answer, it depends.
Yeah,
I'll give you
absolutely. I
what, right?
know. I wish there was one
Because
answer. There's
I think
not.
I'm dealing with five product managers with this same problem. They
Yeah.
have a vision, they have what they're trying to achieve, but what they've had to do is the leadership gives them a PowerPoint saying, here's our corporate vision, and here's our initiatives. And they aren't amenable. They aren't in an OKR form. Okay. They're not an
Absolutely.
OKR. There's, I don't know, some people on the have probably seen CEO objectives for the year. And somehow everything fits into the CEO objective. And so there are 256 projects. So sometimes what the product manager is struggling with is funding is saying to their leaders, this is how, because you have to, in product thinking, the user is one aspect of it, right? How is it impacting the business, and do the stakeholders understand how you implement this vision, it'll have this impact on the business,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? Because when you do an OKR, it has to have a impact on the business also.
Yep. Yep.
And OKRs imply that we know already
Mm-hmm.
what the business is saying, the larger vision is and the larger benchmarks. So product managers will really struggle with, they have their vision but they're not empowered to really own that.
Yep. Yep.
And then the other issue they'll have is the way again, this gets back to collaboration. If you're a product manager and you do not have a relationship, or you do not have a product team that includes engineers that can pull that off, and I work with a lot of product managers who are in that spot where they're now competing with other product managers for Oracle developers or some such
Mm-hmm.
thing like
Mm-hmm.
that. That's not great. That's a higher level problem with prioritization.
Yep. Yep.
And that was a conversation I was having, which is the stakeholders aren't agreed on the priority. And I was at Bloomberg for 4 years working with their product teams. And this was an issue because one of the branches of the company that sold data, they had different markets they were creating data for. And one of them was legal. Legal was a nascent market. They did
Yep.
not have a real product yet. So it was more like a startup. So as soon as they started really looking at OKRs and chartering the products and what outcomes they were looking for, legal got really nervous because legal
Mm.
wasn't making money yet.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't have and then they were fighting for resources from other product managers. So leadership didn't understand, like they needed to actually communicate to the legal team, you're still going to have resources. You're still a product. We know you're a startup. They're just saying, product managers, tell us what your key results are going to be.
Yep.
And it freaked everybody out in that legal team because there weren't dollar signs within the next quarter. And so a lot of it does get back to leadership. That being said, if you, as a product manager, if you're being helpful, if you discover things that are helpful to leaders, and by the way, this might not even be your functional leader.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This might be somebody who's relying on what you do for their business unit. That's not their product manager.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can bring the data and bring the information, and that's a way to become influential in the hierarchy. So I think it's tough in UX and in product because you need to be effective in your role, and then as product, and you also need to be influential in the organization, which is not the collaboration I was talking about. It's a different animal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. When I'm looking down, I'm feverishly taking notes, Holly.
No, yeah.
I was wondering, I get this a lot, and you touched upon it earlier, to go back to it, the basics of objectives and key results. You said one of the big challenges and problems you see when you go into an organization is that the teams in organization, they're mixing up what a key result is and what a key performance indicator is.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean, and what are the differences there, and how do you guide teams when they're having that confusion in terms of how to put together solid key results?
I think it's so confusing. So
Yeah.
it really is how companies are doing this, because they'll say, "Oh, our KPIs," and I'm like, "Okay, based on what then? What performance? What key performance?" So that's the key performance indicator should be reinforcing your OKRs, your objectives, and your key results.
Mm-hmm.
Now, or it should give you a really good idea of when something is changing in a good or a bad way,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you can have these in technology really easily. You can do performance. I think that's one of the key things that's used. If we have more latency in our services, then we want to look at that. And so you have a whole monitor spread of all these like key performance indicators. When you're talking about performance from a user standpoint, you could say we've seen a decrease through the shopping cart, right? So one of our key performances, number of searches done or something like that. And so those are really meant for monitoring
Yep.
because you want to make sure that your performance is okay.
Yep.
So if
This,
people aren't about, so they map up to what then? They map up what for, right? What are they for? So I think in some cases they're trying to be objectives and key results when
yeah.
they're actually just how are we performing right now?
Okay. Yep. Yep.
And
I have another question about OKRs. I also wanted to say we have a small but mighty audience. While I'm asking this next question to Holly, if there are any questions from attendees that you'd like to ask, please feel free to raise your hand or chat in the window. I'd love to make time for any specific questions you have. So feel free to chime in. I also turned off the capabilities. If you want to turn on your video to talk to Holly, you can do that as well. I was thinking about OKRs in general, and you mentioned and highlighted the importance of the time bound aspect
mhm.
of OKRs. This may be another answer where it depends. In terms of teams and organizations, when they're putting together their OKRs, is there a typical time frame that you're finding works well for thinking about an OKR, whether it's quarterly, or what is a time frame that works effectively for teams?
So in terms of a key result, right? And I was talking about leading and lagging indicators.
Mm-hmm.
So you always want to be looking at how soon.
Yeah.
How soon can we do something that is valuable or gets us closer?
Mm-hmm.
That being said, though, like most companies are looking quarterly because of the way we work, quarterly
Mm-hmm.
results, especially public companies, but I've worked with private companies who do quarterly results. It's also true that doing a customer facing release or a user facing release, it's orderly to have it be in a quarterly fashion so you don't have change fatigue on the part of users or customers. But yeah, the issue is that we're always doing discovery and we're always learning things and we should always be doing research. Time bounding time at quarters, I've seen it encourage people to only do things at the quarter's end, only do things just before a quarter begins, right? Not think about anything, not do any research until it's an emergency kind of thing. And so we talk about continuous discovery for continuous delivery. And that's what we want. We want continuous learning. So you can get confused between these different cycles because the further you get out we know this, right? So you could have a year-long roadmap, but the longer that roadmap is, the more likely you're building the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not learning, right, if there starts to be this shift, and then pretty soon you're releasing something that no one wants, or your roadmap is wrong now, right? So you really have to be constantly learning and discovering and revising those things. But most
Absolutely.
companies, like formally, they're doing quarterly from what I've seen.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Holly. I have a question from Nate. Nate
Hi,
asked,
Nate.
thanks for joining, Nate. Nate was asking any suggestions on how to balance and navigate company OKRs versus product OKRs.
So company OKRs saying what the objective is to the company and what the key results are for the company versus any individual product in the company. Is that
Hey, Nate, if you're open to it, would you
you
like
can
to
talk?
unmute? You can talk.
Otherwise, I'm just going to continue to try to answer it and
Here
and
I
comes
can,
assume the
Nate. He's
answers.
unmuted.
Okay.
I can talk.
Yay! Hi, Nate.
I'll even show my face. Hey,
Hi,
everybody.
Nate.
Yeah, so what I often see is company OKRs tend to be the business problems, right? Like revenue and acquisition and those kinds of things, which
Yeah.
are important, but from a product standpoint aren't as neat, I don't think, because we got to actually
Yep.
do things. And so then
Hmm.
mapping those down into product OKRs, meaning, hey, we're going to try to drive this outcome for this particular user in this way, which should have the impact that we want back up into the business OKRs. And
Yeah. Yeah. I
it's
think that
balancing that and mapping it and all the things.
yeah, this is getting really to the the types of different types of products, right? So that's the way, the difference between a business OKR and a product OKR is a business OKR is about what we want. So it usually is about, we want this revenue, we want to save this money, we want to become more efficient here, we want to save money, we want to make money. So that's a business OKR. The complexity of going from that level to a product OKR is usually that the company is not set up to easily track down to product teams. They're not set up in product teams. They don't realize they have so for example, you have a manufacturing company and they sell a widget and they say our goal is to increase market share by 5% and then decrease operating costs by $3 million or something. So taking that and translating it down into the organization in a manufacturing company doesn't usually go very well because they don't realize that their software products are products. And by the way, this is the same thing that's happened at, I know I mentioned Bloomberg, but several companies, they look at their engineering software products not as products at all. So they're treating their products, their software products, just projects that need to be done. And that makes it nearly impossible they'll just say, okay, we have this idea in these different parts of the organization, and we're going to fund these software projects for the year. And that just means that all the engineering teams say, and if there are product managers, and there usually are, they end up just running after output instead of, or they'll argue that they'll just spend time with a PowerPoint arguing that their project is the one that's going to increase revenue or save money. And then they just get their project funded based on who had the nicest PowerPoint or who was seen as successful before. I think that's actually the key issue for a lot of these things is that the product hierarchy is not known and the organizational hierarchy just takes over.
Thanks, Holly. Nate, do you have other questions for Holly?
I had one other one that I was starting to type out. It's a problem I see that you talked about quarterly cycles a bit, and I've seen that get really exhausting if we're redoing OKRs every quarter. And so what I end up trying to get people to do is think about OKRs as longer term things and the KRs as the increments that we're going to shift over quarters. So if we're going to, I don't know, increase retention from 50% to 100%. This quarter, our goal is to get that up 10% and then another 15% in the following quarter or whatever. Instead of saying, we're going to do this whole cycle of inventing new objectives every quarter, which starts the day the quarter starts. Just a never-ending cycle at that point, and it feels like thrash. So I wondered if you had similar experience or other ideas there.
I would give you my standard answer, which is it just depends, right? It depends on what the product is you're dealing with, depends on the size of the company, and it depends on how quickly you can deliver to an impactful objective, I think, within the product team you're in. But yeah, I totally get your point, because also how fast your customers and users move. Since we're talking about changing customer behavior, how quickly can you really change? And I see that with companies who are doing employee enabling products. In fact, I got one client who thought Agile meant releasing to users every sprint. So in Agile, that means you have a 2 or 3 week time period that you're building something, and then you should release that immediately to users. And they asked me, our stakeholders don't understand Agile because we're releasing every sprint to users, and they're mad about it. Because they're testing in production in a lot of cases doing that. And the users are trying to do their jobs. And the user will just log on and see this whole different thing. And it's not helpful. So I think that there are some things about, like your point, Nate, that are being thoughtful and consciously doing this stuff is really important. not just following a rule, right? What is right? Not just following rules or a framework that someone else has said this is how you do it, right? It's easier to do that, but it doesn't work a lot
Well,
of times.
Holly, also, I had written down, you're absolutely right. I think it's also inspirational and motivational for the product managers to have a product leader in-house who's not strictly adhering to hard and fast rules. As you said, Holly, it comes with intention. One of my takeaways from the discussion and your approach, Nate, I've seen the other angle where okay, people put together their OKRs. They're on a quarterly timeline to revisit them. But guess what? They hit their objective and key results. And the product leadership says, look, we're good. We don't have to strictly adhere to this timeline. Let's figure out what works for our team. Like having not sticking to the hard and fast rules and having the flexibility to make decisions in terms of how to use these methods in a way that works for you.
Mhm. No, and I think that's the biggest challenge. And in fact, that's when Jeff Godhelp had the Agile dead?
Yeah.
If is Agile dead? And the punchline of that article is really we need to get back to outcomes. We need to, and one of the things he says in that is that frameworks are can be not helpful because and then he used the word framework somewhere else, but it was funny, like not in that article, but somewhere else, because it's you can have a framework for thinking, but if you're strictly following a framework that somebody told you that you should use, then you're not doing things in a conscious way. You're not doing things thinking about what your context is. I think that's one of the bigger challenges because the answer is that this is not simple. Building software that people want to use that is impactful for your company, that's hard. It's not easy, and there isn't a one size fits all recipe for that.
Thank you very much.
It's
I'm not
Christine.
surprised I learned a lot from this session. I had wondered in terms of feedback from both of you. So the goal of these sessions is to keep them small, not always quite this small and intimate, but small. And we're bringing in product managers, UX folks, and developers. And I'm curious from both of your perspectives in product leadership, are there specific challenges or topics that you think bringing those three core groups together, certain topics that you'd be interested in hearing more about? Basically, it's my discovery right now in terms of what you're hearing and what you'd want to learn more about.
We're both thinking.
I've played all three of those roles,
Yeah.
and so I have an interesting perspective on it. I'm always looking at why don't those three disciplines collaborate better, and why do we see that sometimes they don't? I think one of the interesting ones that I run across is the story is that there's engineers on the team that just want to be told what to build, and I don't believe that, but I hear it a lot. And so if we're having that sort of conversation, is what are the conditions under which engineers fall back to that, right? Where I suspect that they've been burned or beaten down to a point where they don't want to collaborate and participate in feasibility risk kinds of things, helping us build the right solution. So it's, there's interesting conversations around collaboration between those three roles, and how do we maximize that, because that's when we win.
I really appreciate your perspective, Nate, too. You're right. There's the surface level discussion and conclusion around why these competencies and team members act or say or behave in the way they do. But how do we get to that next level about what's really happening there? To your point, I think that's where I'm hoping to get to. And admittedly, I've mainly been on the product UX side. So some of my developer pals have said, hey, you're not getting the full story. When are we coming in? So there's still a little bit of a silo here too, but having these
Mm.
conversations will be so important.
And I would be interested to hear more about the UX PM divide from
Mhm.
a larger UX perspective. You said you already talked about that, but I know that sometimes the UX itself has been confusing for a long time. Is it research? Is it this? Or what does UX do? Is it just design? What is it? But it's such a problem
Mhm.
because so many product managers, they don't even have anybody who helps them from a user perspective, and they have to do all of that work. So why aren't companies hiring more? And we talked about this before, Christine. why aren't companies doing the research as much as they have been before? Why is it that we don't have, I'm working with this company that has 8 people in UX across the whole global organization, 8 people in UX. And they can't in a sustained way help anybody for very long, and they're not set up in product teams or problems, but 8 UX people for the whole organization, it's not enough. So why is that?
Mm-hmm.
What does anybody think the root causes of that? Can we
Yep.
solve that?
Yep.
Yeah. Because we talk a lot about product teams, but if we don't have UX people,
It's
right?
interesting from like the UX industry, and you'll see a lot of UX folks waxing poetic and like, why aren't we having the influence? All of our groups have these conversations about how we gain more traction and have more influence. But one conversation that's come up with the UX folks is, at your core, we all want to understand people. So can we understand our audience, the product managers, the product leaders, the engineering leaders? And to your point, Holly, and Nate, how do we get to the core issues here? Let's talk to our audience. And all too often, I'm seeing the UX professionals get in the mindset of us. We're not having the influence versus what's happening out there with our key teammates and collaborators to make this be the case. So yeah, I'd like to have more conversations about that too. So thank you both.
All right.
This has been incredibly valuable.
Thanks,
Thank you both.
Christine.
Thank you both.
Nice to see you.